Up. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Cary, with whom I've worked over the last several years on questions of common interest. Cary retired from a long career as an English professor at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana. He's been an extraordinarily productive scholar with dozens of books to his credit. In more recent years, he's turned attention to anti-Semitism as it manifests itself in particular against Zionism and the state of Israel. A major book he did, right here, Gary, you won't mind if I show it off, I'm sure. I strongly recommend it. It's called The Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel, the first and in many ways still most important volume on that subject. Cary then followed that up with this book, Israel Denial, Anti-Zionism, Anti-Semitism, and the Faculty Campaign Against the Jewish State. I'm proud to say that both books came out with Indiana University Press. I'm hoping that'll be the case with his next book as well, which is entitled, as you know, Peace and Faith, Christian Churches and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, a volume that he's co-edited with Michael Gizzi. Without further ado, Cary, I'm happy to turn over to you to speak to us today about a strain of Christian anti-Semitism that's revived fairly energetically within certain churches. And I'm sure you'll give us a very, very good overview of all that's happening.
Thank you, Alvin. And of course, thanks to both you and Gunther for organizing this wonderful series. It's an incredible, compelling set of speakers that are set up for the next round. I really look forward to that. Thanks to Abby for helping to keep us in line and sending us what we need to know. And of course, thanks to all of you for participating. I have to acknowledge that having looked at the list of people who have signed up and are online so far, that there's a lot of knowledge in this list, probably a good deal more collectively than I've got in my own head. There are people I respect. There are people who are cited in this book over and over again. So hopefully you'll have things to add besides telling me how wrong I am. What I'm going to do today is draw on a portion of the introduction to Peace and Faith. The introduction is 90 pages long in manuscript. I'm not sure if that's the longest introduction in human history, but it's long. And during the question period, if people are interested, I can offer some interesting gossip about the book, but I won't include that in the talk. So on January 26, 1904, Theodor Herzl met with Pope Pius X to seek the Pope's support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Cardinal Emery del Val, the Vatican Secretary of State, attended as well. According to Herzl's account in his diaries, which is not disputed, the Pope's reply was blunt, quote, "We cannot give approval to this movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it. The soil of Jerusalem, if it was not always sacred, has been sanctified by the life of Jesus Christ. As the head of the church, I cannot tell you anything different. The Jews have not recognized our Lord, therefore we cannot recognize the Jewish people." After Herzl elaborated on his argument, asking that the religious issue be set aside in face of the rise of anti-Semitism, the Pope added that the Jewish religion was the foundation of our own, but it was superseded by the teachings of Christ, and we cannot concede it any further validity. So supersessionism, there it was. Over 100 years later, Pope Benedict XVI, on his 2009 visit to the Holy Land, would not only endorse the Jewish state's right to exist, quote, "Let it be universally recognized that the state of Israel has the right to exist and to enjoy peace and security within internationally recognized borders," but he also commended the two-state solution and gave that form of peace something like biblical status by invoking Isaiah 42:6. "Let peace spread outwards from these lands. Let them serve as to a light unto the nations." Now, Benedict's statement is fundamentally aspirational, something like a contextual prayer rather than a formal theological declaration. In one of the little recognized features of what remains a substantially hierarchical church, even a pope's statements in and of themselves do not necessarily possess ultimate doctrinal authority, but they obviously carry practical weight in encouraging Catholics worldwide to think in a particular way. And the Catholic Church still has the capacity to influence world opinion and have impact on how some Protestant denominations see religious issues. The complex web of Vatican divisions and agencies also speak with varying degrees of authority. Not that press accounts necessarily recognize that. So in the press, everything that comes from anywhere in the church is absolute, but it ain't that way. However, papal statements carry inertial, incremental force when they build on, amplify, or reinforce central elements of evolving theology. Benedict's prayer most centrally reinforces the impact of 1965's Nostra Aetate, widely regarded as the single most positively transformative document in Jewish-Christian relations in centuries. To understand how we got from Pius X to Nostra Aetate and to Benedict's prayer requires some history. We need to review the distinction between hard and soft supersessionism, and we need to recognize that supersessionism returns in several different ways, most of them now grounded in fundamental attacks on the existence of the Jewish state, though not in warranted critiques of Israeli policy. The return or revival of supersessionism, I add revival because it never really went away. I like the way return sounded in the title, but really it's more a revival. It's partly in the replication of supersessionism's structural features and partly with the echoing of its implementing anti-Semitic tropes, that is, both structurally and discursively in tropes that recur. Thus, to cite one of my favorite people, when Rutgers faculty member Jasper Puar revives blood libel accusations by saying Israelis are harvesting Palestinian organs or deliberately stunting the growth of Palestinian children, she helps facilitate a structural and temporal claim that the Jewish state's covenantal and moral authority have been superseded. Christian BDS advocates tend to make the moral and theological arguments in tandem. That is, both arguments occur. And I hope that's apparent in the Presbyterian publications analyzed in the background reading you received, which if you didn't read it beforehand, there'll be a link. You can read that afterwards, that's a draft version of one of the chapters in the book. Part of what I'm going to do today is to give you the arguments and tropes that will enable you to recognize the correspondences between supersessionism and the demonization of the Jewish state. Though I'm not going to be able to document all those correspondences, it kind of takes a book. I'm expecting this book will be over 600 pages in print, so there's a lot in there, tiny type, to talk about the way that particular denominations work out that political and theological overlap. Okay. Within a few hundred years of the establishment of the Christian church, a temporal narrative coalesced to define Christianity's relationship with its Jewish sources. R. Kendall Sulin summarizes the story in which the church supersedes or replaces Judaism. Quote, God's abiding commitment to creation passes through the flesh of the people Israel in the Old Covenant and ultimately lodges with irrevocable finality in one Jewish man, Jesus of Nazareth. But with that, the vocation of the people Israel reaches its foreordained goal and comes to an end. In the process, God's commitment to Israel's flesh is revealed as only a passing stage on the way to God's truly abiding commitment, which is to Christ and the community of salvation in its spiritual form. So this encapsulates hard supersessionism, the theological position that largely defined the church until the mid-1960s, when formal efforts to moderate or mitigate supersessionism in an alternate theology began to emerge, producing what's now come to be known as soft supersessionism. In an essay, The Covenant in Rabbinic Thought, David Novak distinguishes between the hard and soft versions of supersessionism, and Eugene Koren has summarized the difference succinctly. He writes, hard supersessionism, the doctrine that the new covenant replaced the Jewish covenant, and that after Jesus, God rejected the Jews in favor of the church, was the long-standing Christian teaching regarding Judaism and the Jews. The new Israel has invalidated the old Israel, and the new covenant of the Spirit rendered the Mosaic covenant limited temporally, that is, during the time the Jerusalem temple stood. The concurrent validity of the Mosaic covenant and the new covenant, soft supersessionism, the doctrine that the church has grafted onto the living tree of the Jewish people, that the new covenant is the ultimate fulfillment of the still living Jewish covenant, with its implication that there could be concurrent validity to both the Mosaic and the new covenants, was entertained by only a few early Christian thinkers, but ultimately rejected by early normative Christian theology, which was very heavily shaped by Augustine's hard supersessionist understanding of covenantal history. With the advent of the new Spirit, the Mosaic covenant became meaningless. Indeed, it became an obstacle to future salvation history. According to hard supersessionism, if Christianity is true, post-temple Judaism must be false, or at least dead. As Joseph Small points out, categories of promise, Old Testament, and fulfillment, New Testament, have served to downgrade the life and faith of Israel to the status of a kind of religious preface. Edward Kessler earlier wrote, fulfillment easily slides into replacement, and substitution theory is thus alive and well. Fulfillment still often leaves us in supersessionist territory. As Stephen McMichael writes, by the time we get to the end of the Middle Ages, the standard theological position was that only the moral commandments of the Old Covenant were to be observed, and everything else of the Old Covenant was null and void in terms of its religious and salvific efficacy. The Old Testament plays a role purely to point, usually in a way that erases itself through pointing by way of allegory and typology to what's known in the New. The Torah and Jewish tradition are now past memories rather than living terms. For hard supersessionism, the Old Covenant is dead. The Jews, by their sins, most prominently their sin of rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, have forfeited any covenantal status. Indeed, from this perspective, the failure to embrace Jesus as the Messiah led to the Jews being cast out of the land of Canaan. Hard supersessionists treat Jews who are not Christians as if they were dead. To hard supersessionists, it's almost accidental that Christianity came from the Jewish people and their Judaism at all. Whereas hard supersessionists look to Christianity as emerging ex nihilo, as it were, soft supersessionists look to Christianity as emerging de novo. Ex nihilo suggests Christianity has no predecessor. De novo implies Christianity emerged from a pre-existing reality, namely Judaism. Yet even soft supersessionism aims to displace Judaism by negating the covenantal promise through its spiritualization, thereby erasing the value of Jewish attachment to the Holy Land and transferring its sacrality to Christianity. The land of Israel is only a symbolic pointer toward a very different land, a heavenly homeland. In the process, Christianity promotes a corrupting self-aggrandizement. Imagining that it has replaced Israel, the church becomes susceptible to distorted, idealized images of itself. And that process, of course, can be traced through the history of violent anti-Semitism. And some of it is now replicated in arguments against the validity of the existence of the Jewish state. The church's self-aggrandizement is facilitated by a carnality-spirituality binary, which is imposed on the opposition between Judaism and Christianity, with the church declaring itself the new spiritual Israel that had superseded the old carnal Israel in God's election and design. In that model, the old carnal Israel existed merely as a kind of temporary foreshadowing of the spiritual reality to come. It was always thus. The spiritual church is destined from all eternity to replace carnal Israel in God's plans. Israel corresponds to Christ in a merely prefigurative and carnal way, whereas the church corresponds to Jesus Christ in a definitive and spiritual way. The Old Testament dispensation, then, has redemptive power solely by virtue of its reference to the future coming of Christ. However, as the Word made flesh, Jesus' physical presence troubles the spirituality-carnality binary in ways that cannot easily be overcome as they historically have been by invocations of mystery. And that strategy continues really up through recent decades. Michael Weissograd's compelling declaration that Israel, quote, is the carnal anchor that God has sunk into the soil of creation, stands or can stand as a definitive rejoinder in that debate. It was, I think, largely inevitable that supersessionist theology would lead to the triumphalist teaching of contempt toward Judaism. Supersessionism embodies the assumption that the stature and truth of Christianity is founded on the rejection of Judaism. Indeed, Jewish ritual observance as a result is declared not only dead, but deadening, a destructive force. As Sulin writes, supersessionism has shaped the narrative and doctrinal structure of classical Christian theology in fundamental and systematic ways. Now, it may be the case that this idea is arguably so deeply rooted in Christianity that it cannot easily be excised, if excised at all. And I don't think it can be. I don't think you can actually eliminate it. The Gavin DaCosta argues that soft supersessionism in some form is simply necessary to Catholicism. Yet genuine Christian-Jewish dialogue cannot take place until the erasure of Judaism implicit in supersessionism is at least somehow mitigated. The Catholic Church, along with mainline Christian churches, has followed the route of theological mitigation. Not all Protestant churches have done so. Certainly, the Mennonites would be one example of a church that really hasn't done that in a majority way. But founded on that historical work of mitigation, both institutional and individual behavior, I think, can be reformed, substantially purged of contempt, though contempt returns when the Jewish state and symbolically all Jews are rejected once again. But a rapprochement of sorts can follow from a position that Christians and Jews can agree to disagree theologically. That's something I think that one can live with. Supersessionism is now, as I've said, experienced a resurgence in the rise of anti-Zionism. But again, it never actually disappeared. Nostra Aetate in 1965 sought to put an end to supersessionism's single most malicious abiding prop. The conviction, paired with fantasies that Jews were poisoning the wells and murdering Christian children, to give warrant not only anti-Semitism, but also to group murder and pogroms. And that warrant for homicide, of course, was the conviction that Jews killed Jesus. Prompted at first by Palestinian liberation theology and its key advocates, notably Jerusalem-based Anglican cleric and founder of the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, Naim Atik, a series of anti-Zionist tropes created contemporary analogs to deicide. As Atik stated in 2001, quote, "It seems to many of us that Jesus is on the cross again with thousands of crucified Palestinians around him." And he's restated that in more elaborate ways. Palestinians were appointed living victims of, living victims of Jewish organized crucifixions under the slogan, "Christ at the checkpoint," suffering as Jesus did. Absurdly, and I think that's warranted, Jesus himself was characterized as a Palestinian by some, including Palestinian liberation theologian Mitri Raheb. Echoing an Atik reflection, the US Methodist Church issued a book-length anti-Zionist manifesto, Israel-Palestine, a mission study for 2007 to 8, that transferred a recurrent Christian challenge, who moved the stone, blocking Christ's tomb, and facilitated its resurrection to Israel. So that Methodist document says the state of Israel has placed a boulder blocking Palestinian liberation, and then asks who will move the stone. I don't think this is a particularly delicate or obscure allusion. Unlike the BDS movement in Christian churches, the secular BDS movement has little interest in religious supersessionism, but it certainly embraces a secular equivalent. Any moral authority Israel may have possessed in the wake of the Holocaust has been eradicated by Palestinian victimhood and superseded by Palestinian moral authority. So that's part of the fundamental structural parallel. More broadly, any moral authority progressive Zionists worldwide might have possessed is now null and void. The argument put forward, amongst others, by Stephen Salaita and Nora Ericott, that Zionists should be cast out of all progressive causes and organizations, draws on the same currents and implicates most Jews in the process. The broad context for these themes is our understanding of how theology did and continues to evolve across the whole range of Christian churches. The narrower context is how attitudes toward the Abrahamic covenant play out when Christian churches reflect on the status of the Jewish state, particularly when confronted by the Christian wing of the BDS movement. Christians are haunted, as Benjamin Ish Shalom puts it, by the possibility that the return of the Jews to Zion is, quote, a religious event transcending accepted historical political categories. The possibility is prominent for Christian BDS. As Gary Anderson writes, it's difficult for Christians to avoid asking, quote, how is one to understand the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in our own day theologically? The challenge for the religious believer has been whether or not to understand it as part of the eschatological fulfillment of scriptural promises. As detailed readings of a series of texts suggest, the Christian BDS movement, in effect, embraces various versions of hard supersessionism. In their view, not only Israelis, but also Zionists worldwide have transgressed against the moral code on which the ancient Jewish covenant was conditioned, and thus have lost whatever land guarantees the covenant included, since Zionists are in effect crucifying Jesus once more in the person of suffering Palestinians. And that trope, amongst other things, leads to the demonization of the tiny Jewish state as the new Roman Empire. Among Americans who believe God's covenant with the Jews is conditional upon their behavior, one of the more prominent is former US President Jimmy Carter. In his 1985 book, The Blood of Abraham, he recalls attending a Sabbath service at a kibbutz in northern Galilee during his 1973 trip to Israel. He was shocked that there were only 2 other worshipers. When he meets Prime Minister Golda Meir toward the end of the trip, the experience still troubles him. He tells her about the Sabbath service and remarks what seems, quote, a general absence of religious interest amongst the Israelis, an observation that doesn't altogether need to be updated. Then he gives her a theological warning for the present, quote, I commented that during biblical times, the Israelites triumphed when they were close to God and were defeated when unfaithful. In the feedback loop that operates with supersessionism and its collateral concepts, the belief that the state of Israel has abrogated the covenant between God and the Jews reinforces the conviction that Christianity has superseded Judaism. A detailed argument fusing the supersessionist and theological and political arguments that Israel's conduct has voided the Jewish people's right to the land can be found in Walter Brueggemann's influential short 2015 book, Chosen, Reading the Bible Amid the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. A professor emeritus at Columbia Theological Seminary in Georgia and a member of the United Church of Christ, Brueggemann regularly advocates for BDS. He describes Israelis as, quote, a covenant people and a state that relies on military power without reference to covenantal restraints. There are 2 separate questions here, each relevant to the claim. One, whether Israel exercises restraint in responding to military action from Hamas, the paramilitary group that's controlled Gaza since 2007, and 2, whether the government of Israel conceptualizes restraint in terms of its biblical covenant. The answer to the first question is yes, within limits, as evidenced by the relative care Israel has taken to minimize civilian deaths during armed conflict. The answer to the second question, I believe, is no, as Israel applies the ethical principles embodied in whole centuries of Jewish tradition, rather than self-consciously trying to emulate covenantal restraints. Brueggemann wants to conflate the 2 questions, as his book demonstrates, so that he can bring down the wrath of the ancient prophets upon Israel. Drawing on passages in Deuteronomy, he warns us to, quote, conclude that the land is given to Israel conditionally, but it is held, given to Israel unconditionally, but it is held by Israel conditionally. Brueggemann and the BDS movement want us to believe the covenant has been broken anew in our own time. In the 70s and 80s, though new versions of soft supersessionism began to appear, Jews concerned with these distinctions often experienced soft supersessionism as supersessionism nonetheless, even if interfaith dialogue is often facilitated by the shift. Pope John Paul's 1980 declaration that the covenant with the Jewish people had never been revoked, in effect gave the soft supersessionist trend, ironically, a crucial boost. As Mary Boyes and others have pointed out, declaring that the divine covenant with the Jews has not been revoked leaves open what the positive implications might be, since to assert that the old covenant has not been revoked carries little import if there's no theological reason for the existence of Judaism after the coming of Jesus Christ. The result is the evisceration of the God of Israel in Christian theology. Given that soft supersessionism aims to change centuries of theology and rectify the severe human consequences it's produced, it's not surprising that the process has taken time, nor has it been without backsliding. As Mary Boyes suggests in her account of Cardinal Ratzinger's 1998 book, Many Religions, a single text can embody both trends. Thus, although, quote, the Sinai covenant is indeed superseded, Ratzinger argues, its greater truth inheres in and will be revealed for those who turn to Christ. Boyes points out that the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church, quote, gives its readers virtually no sense of Judaism as a living, vital tradition. It may speak of the covenant as not having been revoked, but that covenant seems only to play a preparatory role. On the other hand, Michael Senior reports that some contemporary Jewish texts on the covenant issue did not utilize the discourse of old and new. They try to move in the direction of covenant as a relationship rather than covenant as a boundary marker. They seem to be removed from the diachronic or progressive notion that new is better than old. Boyes calls progression elegantly, I think, the positive side of discontinuity. In other words, she recognizes that progression leaves discontinuity in place. I'm almost done. In recent years, some evangelicals have qualified their convictions about the end of days and about the role contemporary history and geopolitics play in preparing for those events. In doing so, they abandon the certainty of premillennial dispensationalism for what's been called the new Christian Zionism. Dispensationalists embrace a 19th century belief in a broad theological periodization of history. Premillennial dispensationalists like John Hagee, prominent in the ceremony opening the new embassy in Jerusalem, and Jerry Falwell anticipate Christ returning to rule the earth for 1,000 years. New Christian Zionism, a movement that includes both evangelical and non-evangelical Christians, espouses humility about human knowledge of history's trajectory. It rejects the notion that we can plot the sequence or chronology of end time events, which I've always considered a form of madness, but so be it. On the contrary, for new Christian Zionists, the end of days is a mystery we must not think we can penetrate with any precision, which is another version of the invocation of mystery as a way of solving the dilemma. Abandoning the certainty that the end of days is readably inscribed in contemporary events does allow for a more nuanced relationship with Israel, in which Israeli policies can be criticized, which many evangelicals don't want to do, but which Israel's right to exist is unquestioned, and better relations between Jews and Christians worldwide can result. A two-state solution becomes plausible because it's no longer considered heretical, as it is for Hagee certainly, for Israel to cede part of its covenantal land to achieve peace. Embracing the Jewish state puts to rest the long-held Christian conviction that Jews were cast aside by God for rejecting Jesus as the Messiah and thus doomed to live in exile from the promised land until either they repent of their error or the kingdom of God arrives. Rather than give Judaism a theological and historical role that's functional but decidedly transitory, some Christian Zionists insist instead that both Christianity and Judaism will be transformed when the Messiah arrives. Another kind of tactical move in this poker hand. The position partly parallels some version of Jewish utopian messianism, in which the Messiah's arrival will be heralded by transformative extranatural events, though there are other Jewish messianic traditions, like Moses Maimonides, which are not comparably apocalyptic or utopian. Instead of thinking of Israel as a placeholder for an eventual conversion site, the existing Jewish state is seen by some new Christian Zionists to represent a provisional but proleptic fulfillment of the promises of the world to come, to use Gerald McDermott's phrase. Nonetheless, a functional rapprochement between Christians and Jews is possible. Robert Jensen writes that we are separated by just one question. Did the God of Israel, in fact, raise his servant Jesus from the dead, or did he not? Theologically, yes. That question about Jesus's nature captures what fundamentally separates Christians and Jews. Practically, no. It doesn't suffice to account for the problem. Part of what separates us is ignorance. Rabbi David Rosen, the American Jewish Committee's Director of International Jewish Affairs, observed that he meets bishops who do not know the content of Nostra Aetate. Lisa Palmieri-Billig, the AJC's representative in Italy and liaison to the Holy See, remarks that she meets many Christians who are shocked when told that Jesus was a Jew. How can that be? If Nostra Aetate was a miraculous transformation of the Olympian heights, it has yet to penetrate fully to the grassroots after more than half a century. So education is one route to the further mitigation of supersessionism. Another route would be for Christian churches, including the Vatican, to formally adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Despite continuing efforts of persuasion up to the current year, the Vatican has been unwilling to do so. Less, I think, for theological than for practical political reasons. That's one key priority for the work of reconciliation and an effective way to counter the revival of Christian supersessionism that is based on revival to the Jewish state. Marcus Barth is especially direct. It's not enough to say that salvation came from the Jews, for salvation comes from the Jews. As Karl Barth has written, God's faithfulness to the reality of Israel is in fact the guarantee of his faithfulness to us too, and for all men. The irrevocable, unbreakable covenant with the Jews is the status from which flows Christianity's faith in its own covenantal status. Thanks a lot.